Before Sparta was ever a name spoken with fear or admiration, before shields were raised in perfect formation and discipline became law, there existed a world that shaped it, pressured it, and ultimately forced it into becoming something radically different from every other Greek city-state. Because Sparta was not born from a love of war, but from a deep anxiety of survival. And to understand that truth, we must travel back to a Greece that movies rarely slow down enough to show. A Greece fractured by geography, defined by scarcity, and driven by constant competition, where mountains cut cities off from one another like walls, and the sea served as both lifeline and threat. A land where fertile plains were rare, resources unevenly distributed, and every community was locked in a quiet struggle to endure. Because ancient Greece was never a single nation or culture moving in unison, but a collection of fiercely independent city-states, each developing its own values, systems, and ambitions. And it was this fragmentation that allowed Sparta to become Sparta. Because while places like Athens sat near trade routes and open harbors, exposed to foreign ideas, commerce, art, and debate, the region of Laconia, where Sparta would rise, was isolated, hemmed in by the towering Taygetus Mountains on one side and the sea on the other. Beautiful but unforgiving, fertile enough to sustain life, yet limited enough to create tension. And this isolation was not just physical, but psychological, shaping a people who learned early that help would not come from outside and that survival depended on unity, control, and strength rather than innovation or trade. And long before the Spartans were feared warriors, they were settlers struggling to dominate land that did not easily yield abundance. Because the early Greek world operated on a brutal equation where land meant food, food meant population, population meant power, and power meant survival. And those without enough land faced either submission, migration, or conquest. And it was in this harsh reality that the Dorians entered the Greek peninsula, a migrating people whose arrival around the late Bronze Age reshaped the balance of power across southern Greece. And whether through invasion or gradual settlement, the Dorians displaced older populations and claimed territories that would later become known as Sparta. And unlike later romanticized versions, these early Spartans were not born superior warriors, but rather a minority ruling class in a land filled with those they had conquered. And this fact would haunt Sparta for centuries, because the population they subjugated, particularly the Messenians, vastly outnumbered them, creating a constant, simmering fear of revolt, a fear that would become the foundation of Spartan society, politics, and culture. Because when a ruling class is permanently outnumbered, ideology becomes a weapon, discipline becomes a necessity, and violence becomes institutionalized. And while other Greek city-states responded to insecurity by building walls, expanding trade, or forming alliances, Sparta responded by turning inward, reshaping every aspect of life into a system designed to suppress rebellion and maintain control. But this transformation did not happen overnight, because early Greece was still experimenting with governance, identity, and social organization, moving slowly out of the collapse of the Mycenaean world, where once great palace civilizations had fallen into ruin, trade networks collapsed, literacy disappeared, and communities shrank into self-sufficient villages. And in this so-called Greek Dark Age, survival favored simplicity, tradition, and strength over creativity. And while Athens would later emerge from this period embracing dialogue, philosophy, and political experimentation, Sparta leaned in the opposite direction, valuing continuity over change, obedience over debate, and collective identity over individual ambition, because the environment demanded it. As Laconia's limited arable land meant expansion could only occur through conquest, not commerce. And when Sparta expanded westward into fertile Messenia, it won land but inherited a permanent problem, an enslaved population forced to farm the fields so Spartan citizens could focus exclusively on warfare. And this created a society fundamentally different from every other in Greece. Because while Athens relied on citizen participation, craftsmen, merchants, and thinkers, Sparta relied on an oppressed labor force and a narrow warrior elite. And this imbalance meant that from the very beginning, Sparta lived with the knowledge that one mistake, one lapse in discipline, one generation of weakness could mean annihilation from within. And it is here that we must dismantle the myth that Spartans loved war for its own sake, because war for Sparta was not glory but insurance, not adventure but maintenance, a constant rehearsal for the day the Helots might rise or a rival city-state might sense vulnerability. And this fear-driven mentality explains why Sparta resisted change so aggressively, why innovation was treated with suspicion, and why tradition was elevated to sacred law. Because in a world where everything else seemed unstable, rigidity felt like safety, and while Greek culture as a whole celebrated competition, excellence and honor through athletics, poetry, and philosophy, Sparta stripped these values down to a single axis: military effectiveness, and in doing so, rejected much of what we now associate with classical Greece, including art, monumental architecture, written philosophy, and even historical record-keeping, which is why much of what we know about Sparta comes from outsiders, often enemies, because Sparta itself chose silence over self-expression, secrecy over storytelling, and this decision further amplified its mystique, allowing later generations to fill in the gaps with legend. But the reality is that Sparta's path was shaped by fear of scarcity, fear of rebellion, and fear of extinction. And when you place Sparta back into the wider Greek world, surrounded by rival city-states, constantly testing one another through alliances, skirmishes, and political maneuvering, its choices become less alien and more tragic. Because Sparta was a society that believed it could never afford weakness, never afford division, and never afford compassion toward those it ruled. And so it built a system that prized obedience above happiness, strength above creativity, and endurance above freedom. And while this system would eventually make Sparta one of the most formidable military powers in Greek history, it also planted the seeds of its decline, because a society that defines itself entirely by survival eventually forgets how to live. And before the first Spartan child was taken from his mother, before the agoge turned discipline into ritualized suffering, before the phalanx became a symbol of unity and terror, the foundation was already laid in this earlier world of fractured Greece. Geographic isolation, demographic imbalance, and existential fear. And it is only by understanding this world, this Greece of scarcity and anxiety, that we can truly understand why Sparta became what it was, not as a fantasy of perfect warriors, but as a human response to a brutal environment where survival demanded sacrifice, and where the cost of failure was not defeat, but erasure.
The birth of Sparta as a military state was not the result of a single moment, a single lawgiver, or a sudden revelation, but rather a slow and deliberate hardening of a society that believed its very existence depended on absolute control. And at the center of this transformation stands one of history's most mysterious figures, Lycurgus, a man who may have been a reformer, a composite of multiple leaders, or perhaps never existed at all, yet whose name became synonymous with the system that defined Sparta for centuries, because Lycurgus, whether real or symbolic, represented the idea that Sparta was not governed by the desires of individuals, but by an inherited code, believed to be divinely inspired and therefore unquestionable. And this belief alone explains much about why Sparta evolved so differently from other Greek city-states, because while Athens debated laws in open assemblies and rewrote its constitution multiple times, Sparta treated its laws as sacred, immutable, and eternal, attributing them to Apollo himself through the oracle at Delphi, which meant that to challenge Spartan law was not merely political dissent, but sacrilege. And this fusion of religion, tradition, and governance created a society that resisted change with extraordinary intensity. And according to Spartan tradition, Lycurgus traveled widely, observing other cultures, studying Crete, Egypt, and Asia Minor, before returning to Sparta with a vision for reform. But modern historians suspect that this story was retroactively constructed to legitimize reforms that unfolded gradually over generations, because no society transforms so completely overnight. And yet the myth of Lycurgus served a critical function by framing Spartan institutions as deliberate, purposeful, and divinely sanctioned, rather than improvised responses to fear and instability. And through this myth, Sparta taught its citizens that their way of life was not merely effective, but morally superior, chosen by the gods, and therefore beyond question. And central to this system was what later writers called the Spartan Constitution, a complex blend of monarchy, oligarchy, and limited popular participation that created the illusion of balance while ensuring that true power remained tightly controlled by a small elite. Because Sparta understood that unchecked power in the hands of one ruler risked tyranny, while power in the hands of the masses risked chaos. So it engineered a structure that distributed authority in appearance but concentrated it in reality, beginning with the most unusual feature of Spartan governance, the dual kingship, where two kings ruled simultaneously, each from a separate royal house, a system that appears strange until one recognizes its purpose, because the kings served as mutual restraints on one another, preventing any single individual from accumulating too much power. And while they held religious authority and commanded armies in wartime, their political power was carefully limited, overseen by councils and magistrates who could fine, exile, or even put kings on trial, which meant that the kings were symbols of continuity and tradition rather than absolute rulers. And this system ensured stability while reducing the risk of internal power struggles. But it also reflected Spartans' deeper philosophy that no individual mattered more than the state, not even a king. And above the kings stood the Gerousia, the council of elders, composed of 28 men over the age of 60, plus the two kings, a body that wielded immense influence over legislation, judicial decisions, and policy direction. And membership in this council was for life, elected by acclamation rather than secret ballot, a process that appeared democratic but in practice favored powerful families and entrenched elites. And the Gerousia functioned as the true ideological backbone of Sparta, preserving tradition, blocking reform, and ensuring that laws remained aligned with the conservative values of the ruling class. And while Sparta technically possessed a popular assembly, the Apella, composed of male citizens, its role was strictly limited, because citizens could not debate, amend, or propose laws. They could only vote yes or no on proposals presented to them by the elders, turning participation into ritual rather than power, and reinforcing the illusion that Sparta was a community of equals while maintaining the reality of oligarchic control. And to enforce discipline within this system, Sparta created another institution, the Ephoret, 5 officials elected annually who possessed extraordinary authority, including the power to oversee the kings, control education, administer justice, and even declare war on the Helot population each year. And while ephors were technically elected from among the citizen body, their short terms and immense power created a volatile balance that further centralized authority while diffusing responsibility, ensuring that no single office could be blamed for brutality or oppression. And together, these institutions formed a political machine that prioritized stability, conformity, and control above all else. And it was through this machine that Sparta deliberately rejected the paths taken by other Greek city-states, turning away from wealth, art, philosophy, and individual expression, not because it lacked the capacity for them, but because it viewed them as threats. Because wealth created inequality, inequality bred envy, envy led to division, and division invited rebellion. And in a society permanently outnumbered by its enslaved population, division was not merely inconvenient, but existentially dangerous. And so Sparta outlawed luxury, banned precious metals, replaced coinage with heavy iron bars designed to discourage accumulation, and mocked displays of wealth as weakness, not because Spartans were naturally austere, but because austerity was politically useful, creating an illusion of equality among citizens while preventing the emergence of powerful economic elites who might challenge the state. And art, too, was discouraged, not entirely absent, but stripped of excess, because art invited individuality, interpretation, and emotional expression, qualities that Sparta viewed with suspicion, preferring instead simplicity, repetition, and uniformity. And philosophy, particularly the kind flourishing in Athens, was perhaps the greatest threat of all, because philosophy taught people to question, to debate, to imagine alternatives. And in Sparta, alternatives were dangerous, because the system depended on the belief that no better way of life existed. And this rejection of intellectual inquiry was not ignorance, but strategy, a conscious decision to sacrifice cultural growth for political stability. And this choice shaped every aspect of Spartan identity, from how children were raised to how adults spoke, ate, dressed, and even joked, because brevity itself became a virtue, reflected in the famous laconic speech, where words were minimized and emotion restrained, reinforcing the idea that expression was subordinate to function. And yet, beneath this rigid exterior lay a profound contradiction, because while Sparta preached equality among its citizens, it was in reality one of the most unequal societies in Greece, divided sharply between the Spartiates, the full citizens who owned land worked by helots, the perioikoi, free but non-citizen inhabitants who handled trade and craftsmanship, and the helots themselves, bound to the land and subjected to systemic violence. And this inequality was sustained not through walls or constant warfare, but through ideology, ritual, and fear. And it was the political institutions of Sparta that maintained this delicate balance, ensuring that citizens remained loyal, obedient, and dependent on the state for identity and purpose. And by embedding military readiness into governance itself, Sparta eliminated the distinction between civilian and soldier, because every citizen was always a warrior in waiting, every meal a communal ritual reinforcing unity, every law a reminder that the individual existed only to serve the collective. And this is why Sparta did not simply have an army, but was an army masquerading as a city, where governance, education, religion, and social life all served a single function, the preservation of control. And while later generations would marvel at Spartan discipline and sacrifice, the reality is that this system demanded extraordinary repression, not only of the helots, but of Spartans themselves, denying them choice, creativity, and emotional freedom. And the myth of Lycurgus helped justify this sacrifice by framing it as noble, ancient, and divinely ordained, turning suffering into virtue and obedience into honor. And by refusing to write down their laws, passing them orally from generation to generation, Spartans ensured that their constitution remained flexible in interpretation, but rigid in spirit, controlled by elders who decided what tradition meant at any given moment. And this unwritten nature allowed Sparta to claim timelessness while quietly adapting when necessary, though always slowly and reluctantly. And it is this paradox that defines the birth of Sparta, a society obsessed with permanence, yet born from fear, a state that rejected progress to preserve power, and a political system that presented itself as balanced and communal while quietly concentrating authority in the hands of a few. And when we strip away the legend and examine the machinery beneath, we see that Sparta did not become a military state because
from the moment a Spartan child was born, the state was already watching, already judging, already deciding whether that life was worth the investment. Because in Sparta, childhood was not a private family experience, but a public resource managed by the city. And unlike the cinematic fantasy where boys eagerly trained to become heroes, the reality of the agoge was a system of institutionalized deprivation designed not to inspire greatness, but to eliminate weakness,
instill obedience, and strip away individuality so completely that loyalty to the state replaced every other bond, including family. Because at birth, Spartan elders examined infants for physical deformities, and while modern historians debate the exact extent of infanticide, there is no doubt that physical fitness was treated as a prerequisite for citizenship. And this early scrutiny sent a clear message to both parents and children that love was conditional, value was earned, and survival depended on usefulness. And for the first 7 years, children remained with their mothers, but even this period was shaped by the state's ideology, as Spartan women were expected to raise children who were resilient, unemotional, and accustomed to discomfort, discouraging excessive affection and encouraging early independence, because emotional attachment was seen as a vulnerability that could interfere with obedience later. And then, at age 7, the defining moment arrived, the moment that truly separated Sparta from every other Greek society, when boys were taken from their families and enrolled in the agoge, the state-run education and training system that was less a school and more a prolonged psychological conditioning program. Because the agoge was not primarily about teaching combat techniques, as movies often suggest, but about reshaping identity itself, breaking down the child and rebuilding him as a component of a collective machine. And from the moment they entered the agoge, boys lived in communal barracks under the supervision of older youths and adult officials, deprived of privacy, individuality, and choice, wearing the same simple clothing year-round regardless of weather, sleeping on reeds they gathered themselves, and receiving deliberately insufficient food rations, not because Sparta lacked resources, but because hunger was a tool, a way to teach boys to endure discomfort, to scavenge, to steal, and to operate under constant stress. And while stealing food was encouraged as a survival skill, being caught was brutally punished, not for the theft itself, but for the failure to avoid detection, reinforcing the idea that success mattered more than morality, and that incompetence was unforgivable. And this paradoxical lesson reveals the true purpose of the agoge, which was not to produce ethical citizens, but effective ones, individuals capable of operating in hostile conditions, following orders without hesitation, and accepting pain as normal. And physical punishment was constant, beatings were routine, humiliation was institutionalized, and endurance was celebrated. Because the system was designed to push children to their psychological limits, exposing fear, weakness, and hesitation so they could be eradicated early. And alongside physical hardship came mental conditioning, as boys were taught to speak little, think simply, and respond quickly, developing the laconic style of speech that Sparta became famous for, because long explanations invited debate, and debate threatened hierarchy. And even intellectual development was controlled, with basic literacy taught only to the extent necessary for military and civic function, while curiosity beyond that was discouraged, because knowledge that did not serve the state was considered dangerous. And as boys grew older within the agoge, competition intensified, with older youths placed in leadership roles over younger ones, creating a hierarchy where authority was learned through domination and submission. And this internalization of power dynamics ensured that obedience felt natural and that cruelty could be rationalized as duty. And at the apex of this system lay one of the darkest institutions in Spartan society, the Cryptia, often described as a secret police or rite of passage, where selected youths were sent into the countryside, armed with little more than a dagger and instructed to survive on their own, while terrorizing the helot population, killing those deemed dangerous or too strong. And whether the Cryptia was a formal institution or a recurring practice, its existence underscores the brutal reality of Spartan education, because it blurred the line between training and atrocity, turning adolescent boys into instruments of state violence and normalizing the idea that murder could be justified if sanctioned by authority. And through these experiences, Spartan youths learned not only how to fight, but who they were allowed to harm and why. And it is important to understand that not all boys survived the agoge, not all endured the physical and psychological strain, and those who failed were quietly removed from the path to citizenship, becoming inferior members of society without full rights, a fate considered worse than death by Spartan standards, because citizenship was not a birthright, but a status earned through conformity and endurance.
And even those who completed the agoge were not fully free, because at age 20, they became eligible to join a sicyon, a communal mess group that functioned as both social unit and political filter. And acceptance into a sicyon required unanimous approval, meaning a single rejection could permanently bar a man from full citizenship, reinforcing conformity and peer surveillance. And membership required ongoing contributions of food from one's allotted land, tying military status directly to economic productivity enforced through helot labor. And this system ensured that Spartan identity was inseparable from the state at every stage of life, from birth to death, and that failure was not just personal, but social, because a failed Spartan reflected weakness in the collective. And yet, even within this harsh system, there existed contradictions, because the agoge did produce discipline, cohesion, and resilience, qualities that gave Spartan armies a psychological edge over opponents, but it also produced emotional repression, rigidity, and an inability to adapt, because boys raised without family bonds struggled to form deep personal relationships later, relying instead on loyalty to comrades and commanders. And while this fostered battlefield cohesion, it also limited empathy and creativity. And movies often portray the agoge as a forge of fearless warriors, but fear was not eliminated, it was buried, redirected, and weaponized, because Spartans learned early that expressing fear invited punishment, while suppressing it earned respect. And this culture of suppression extended into adulthood, where vulnerability was equated with weakness, and weakness with danger to the state. And it is also critical to note that the agoge was not solely about boys, because while girls did not undergo the same system, the entire society revolved around preparing males for this path, shaping family life, marriage, and social expectations around the needs of the military state. And in this way, the agoge was not just an educational institution, but the central pillar of Spartan civilization, the mechanism through which values were transmitted, hierarchy was enforced, and the state reproduced itself generation after generation. And while later admirers would praise the agoge for producing disciplined warriors, the human cost was immense, because childhood was sacrificed, individuality was erased, and violence was normalized from an early age, creating adults who were extraordinarily loyal to the state, but often emotionally stunted and socially constrained. And when we strip away the myth of heroic training montages and glorious rites of passage, what remains is a system built on fear, deprivation, and control. A system that treated children not as individuals to be nurtured, but as raw material to be shaped, tested, and discarded if necessary. And this reality forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about Sparta, that its military strength was inseparable from its willingness to dehumanize its own people, beginning with its children, because the agoge was not simply a school for warriors, but a factory for obedience. And in creating soldiers who could endure anything, Sparta also created a society that could feel very little. And this trade-off between strength and humanity would define Sparta's greatness and ultimately contribute to its decline, because a system that suppresses empathy and adaptability may dominate for a time, but it struggles to change when the world around it does. And the agoge, for all its effectiveness, locked Sparta into a rigid identity that could not evolve without undermining itself. And this is the cost that movies never show: the childhoods lost, the lives broken, and the generations raised to believe that suffering was not only inevitable, but virtuous. Because in Sparta, to endure was to belong, and to belong was worth any price.
Spartan women occupy one of the most misunderstood and paradoxical positions in ancient history, often portrayed either as unusually empowered proto-feminists or reduced to harsh mothers who valued the state over their children. But the reality is far more complex, because while Spartan women did enjoy freedoms unheard of elsewhere in Greece, those freedoms were not granted for their own sake, but because they served the needs of a militarized society obsessed with survival, control, and reproduction. And to understand Spartan women, we must abandon modern assumptions about empowerment and instead examine how their roles were engineered by the state to reinforce its military priorities. Because Sparta did not value women as individuals with aspirations or inner lives, but as crucial components in the production and maintenance of warriors. And from birth, Spartan girls were treated differently from girls in other Greek city-states, not sheltered indoors or trained in domestic crafts, but encouraged to develop strong bodies through physical exercise, running, wrestling, throwing the javelin and discus, and even competing in public athletic contests, sometimes nude or lightly clothed, a practice that shocked other Greeks and fed Sparta's reputation for strangeness. But this emphasis on physical strength was not about personal freedom or equality, it was about eugenics, because Spartan ideology held that strong women would produce strong children, and childbirth itself was viewed as a form of service to the state comparable to military service for men, which meant that a woman's value was closely tied to her ability to bear healthy sons. And this biological utilitarianism shaped every expectation placed upon Spartan women, from their upbringing to their marriages. And unlike in Athens, where women were married off as teenagers to much older men, Spartan women typically married later, in their late teens or early 20s, after reaching physical maturity, because Sparta believed that mature women were better suited to childbirth. And marriage itself was surrounded by ritual that blended symbolism with control, including the famous custom where the bride's hair was cut short, she was dressed in men's clothing, and the groom visited her secretly at night, a practice often romanticized as playful, but which in reality served to minimize emotional attachment and preserve the primacy of male communal life. Because Spartan men continued to live and eat in barracks even after marriage, spending limited time with their wives, ensuring that loyalty to fellow soldiers and the state remained stronger than loyalty to family. And this arrangement placed women in a strange position, managing households and estates largely alone while their husbands lived communally, giving them practical authority over property and resources. And it is true that Spartan women could own and inherit land, and by the classical period they controlled a significant portion of Spartan territory, a fact often cited as evidence of their power. But this economic influence emerged not from ideological commitment to gender equality, but from demographic necessity, because constant warfare and the rigid citizen system reduced the number of male Spartiates, leaving women as default managers of property. And while this gave them leverage, it also intensified pressure, because their management skills were expected to support the military system, not challenge it. And Spartan women were encouraged to speak openly, even bluntly, a stark contrast to the silence imposed on women elsewhere. But again, this was functional, because women were expected to reinforce Spartan values publicly, shaming cowardice, praising endurance, and encouraging men to prioritize honor over life. And famous sayings attributed to Spartan women, such as telling sons to return with their shield or on it, are often cited as evidence of their hardness. But these sayings reflect a society that demanded emotional repression from everyone, not just men, because grief itself was politicized, and women who mourned fallen sons openly were criticized, while those who displayed pride were celebrated, reinforcing the idea that maternal love was acceptable only insofar as it aligned with state ideology. And this expectation imposed a heavy emotional burden, because Spartan women were asked to suppress fear for their children, grief for their losses, and personal desires for companionship, channeling all emotion into loyalty to Sparta. And while they were spared the physical brutality of the agoge, they were subjected to relentless social pressure to conform to an ideal of strength, resilience, and reproductive success. And failure carried consequences, because women who did not marry, could not bear children, or produced weak offspring were stigmatized, their bodies and choices scrutinized as matters of public concern. And this surveillance extended even into marriage practices, with Sparta tolerating and in some cases encouraging polyandrous arrangements or sanctioned adultery if it was believed to improve genetic outcomes, a practice that scandalized other Greeks but reveals how thoroughly Sparta subordinated personal relationships to state goals, because fidelity was less important than fertility, and emotional exclusivity was less important than producing strong heirs. And while this flexibility might appear liberating on the surface, it stripped relationships of intimacy and agency, reducing them to biological transactions overseen by ideology.
And Spartan women were also responsible for transmitting values to the next generation, raising children in ways that prepared them for eventual separation and hardship, teaching boys not to fear pain and teaching girls to admire strength and despise weakness, effectively making mothers the first agents of the agoge, internalizing and perpetuating the system that would later take their sons away. And this complicity was not optional, but necessary for social survival, because a woman who resisted these expectations risked ostracism and loss of status. And yet, despite this control, Spartan women did wield real influence, particularly through speech and social pressure, because their voices carried weight in public discourse and their approval mattered to men whose honor depended on communal recognition. And foreign observers often remarked that Spartan women seemed unusually confident, outspoken, and assertive. But these traits existed within narrow boundaries, because while women could criticize men for cowardice, they could not criticize the system itself. And while they could manage property, they could not participate directly in political institutions like the Gerousia or Ephyrae, and their power remained informal, derivative, and conditional, always tied to their roles as mothers and managers rather than autonomous citizens. And this contradiction lies at the heart of the Spartan woman's experience, because she was simultaneously privileged and constrained, visible and controlled, strong and denied agency. And this duality becomes even clearer when we consider how Spartan women were viewed in times of crisis, such as during population decline, when the pressure to reproduce intensified and women's bodies became even more explicitly politicized, blamed for demographic problems while also burdened with solving them. And yet through all of this, Spartan women developed a distinct identity shaped by resilience, pragmatism, and adaptation, navigating a society that demanded strength but offered little emotional support. And while later writers often admired or condemned them based on modern values, the reality is that Spartan women were neither liberated heroines nor heartless enforcers, but individuals living within an extreme system that granted them unusual responsibilities while denying them true freedom. And their relative autonomy existed not because Sparta valued women's rights, but because the state needed women who could sustain a warrior society in the absence of men. And when we view Spartan women through this lens, their story becomes less about empowerment and more about sacrifice, because they were asked to bear the physical pain of childbirth, the emotional pain of separation, and the psychological burden of constant fear, all while presenting an image of strength and pride. And this expectation shaped not only their lives, but the culture of Sparta itself, reinforcing the idea that emotion was weakness and that personal suffering was insignificant compared to the needs of the state. And in this way, Spartan women were both victims and pillars of the system, sustaining a society that relied on their strength while denying them the freedom to define that strength on their own terms. And their legacy challenges simple narratives, forcing us to confront how power can exist without liberation, how visibility can coexist with control, and how a society can grant privileges not as recognition of humanity, but as tools of survival. And just as the agoge forged Spartan boys into soldiers, the social expectations placed on women forged them into guardians of ideology, ensuring that even within the household, the state's values remained unchallenged, passed down quietly from mother to child, generation after generation, until the line between personal belief and imposed doctrine disappeared, leaving behind a society where strength was revered, vulnerability was suppressed, and even love was measured by its usefulness to war.
The true foundation of Spartan power was not discipline, courage, or superior tactics, but an enslaved population whose suffering made the entire Spartan system possible, because without the helots, there would have been no full-time warriors, no agoge, no communal messes, and no illusion of equality among Spartan citizens. And yet this reality is almost entirely absent from popular portrayals, which focus on armored soldiers while erasing the millions of lives lived under constant oppression. Because the helots were not simply slaves in the conventional sense, but an entire people subjugated, terrorized, and systematically dehumanized to sustain a ruling minority that lived in perpetual fear of rebellion. And to understand Sparta honestly, we must confront the helots not as a footnote, but as the central pillar of the Spartan state. because Sparta was less a city-state and more a slave society organized around permanent internal occupation, and the Helots were primarily Messenians, conquered during Sparta's expansion into fertile Messenia, a land far richer than Laconia itself. And this conquest solved Sparta's agricultural limitations while creating an unsolvable political problem, because the conquered population vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens, in some estimates by 7 to 1 or more, meaning that every Spartan lived surrounded by people who hated them, remembered freedom, and had every reason to revolt. And this demographic imbalance shaped every decision Sparta made, because fear became policy, cruelty became preventative strategy, and violence became routine governance. And unlike chattel slaves elsewhere in Greece, who were often foreigners purchased through trade, Helots were tied to the land, forced to farm it for their Spartan masters, handing over a fixed portion of their harvest while barely surviving on the remainder. And this arrangement ensured that Helots remained perpetually poor, malnourished, and dependent, while Spartan citizens enjoyed stability and leisure. And yet, economic exploitation alone was not enough, because Sparta understood that a population kept only by force would eventually resist, so the state embedded terror into everyday life, humiliating Helots publicly, forcing them to wear distinctive clothing, mocking them as drunken fools in front of Spartan youth, and using them as living warnings of what weakness and disobedience led to. Because humiliation was a psychological weapon, teaching Helots their place while reinforcing Spartan identity through contrast. And this constant degradation served another purpose. It trained Spartan citizens to see Helots not as human beings, but as a separate, inferior category of existence, making violence against them easier to justify and less emotionally costly. And nowhere was this dehumanization more explicit than in the annual declaration of war on the Helots by the ephors, a ritual that stripped murder of legal consequence, allowing Spartan youths to kill Helots without religious pollution, transforming what would otherwise be a crime into civic duty. And this ritualized violence reveals the true nature of Spartan law, which was not about justice but control, because the law existed to protect Spartan citizens from one another while explicitly excluding Helots from its protection, creating a dual moral system where ethics applied selectively based on status. And the most chilling expression of this system was the Crypteia, where young Spartans were sent out to live among the countryside, hiding by day and killing by night, targeting Helots who appeared strong, intelligent, or influential, eliminating potential leaders before rebellion could form. And while ancient sources debate how formalized the Crypteia was, its symbolic importance is undeniable, because it represents a society that trained its youth through sanctioned terror, normalizing murder as a rite of passage, and embedding fear into the rural landscape, ensuring that Helots never knew when violence would strike. And this constant threat fractured Helot communities, discouraged organization, and fostered mistrust, because survival depended on invisibility. And yet, despite this oppression, Helot resistance never disappeared, erupting periodically in revolts that shook Sparta to its core, most notably after natural disasters like earthquakes that killed large numbers of Spartan citizens and momentarily weakened control. And these revolts exposed the fragility of Spartan dominance, because whenever the balance of fear shifted, the entire system trembled, forcing Sparta to divert military resources inward rather than outward, guarding against its own labor force rather than projecting power abroad. And this internal focus limited Spartan flexibility, because unlike other Greek states that could expand through colonization or trade, Sparta was trapped, bound to its conquered land and dependent on its oppressed population. And this dependence created a profound contradiction, because the Helots were both despised and indispensable, feared and relied upon. And this contradiction poisoned Spartan society, fostering paranoia and rigidity, because any reform that eased Helot suffering risked rebellion, while any reform that increased exploitation risked the same, trapping Sparta in a cycle of repression that could only be sustained through constant vigilance and violence. And even on the battlefield, Helots played a role, serving as attendants, porters, and sometimes light infantry, exposed to danger without honor or recognition.
And when Spartan armies marched, they were often accompanied by thousands of helots whose labor sustained campaigns, but whose presence also represented a constant risk, because arming the oppressed, even partially, challenged the ideological foundations of the state. And when helots fought bravely, as they sometimes did, Sparta responded not with gratitude, but with fear, executing or dispersing those who proved too capable, because competence among the enslaved was dangerous. And this fear extended into daily life, shaping how Spartans interacted with one another, because a society built on domination must constantly reaffirm hierarchy, leading to harsh discipline not only for helots, but within the citizen body itself, as any sign of weakness was seen as a threat to collective security. And this environment of suspicion eroded trust, replacing cooperation with surveillance. And while Spartan propaganda emphasized unity among citizens, that unity was forged against a shared enemy within, a reminder that solidarity built on oppression is inherently unstable. And ancient writers like Thucydides and Aristotle recognized this, noting that Spartan institutions were designed less to create virtue than to maintain power over a hostile population. And Aristotle in particular criticized Sparta for its treatment of helots, arguing that it corrupted Spartan morality and undermined long-term stability, because a society that practices injustice at home cannot cultivate genuine virtue abroad. And this moral cost is often ignored in modern admiration for Sparta, which celebrates endurance and discipline while overlooking the suffering that made those traits possible. And yet it is impossible to separate Spartan identity from helot oppression, because the very qualities admired in Spartans, their austerity, unity, and focus on warfare, were made possible only because someone else was forced to labor, starve, and live in fear. And this dependence distorted Spartan values, making cruelty seem necessary and compassion seem dangerous. And even Spartan religion and ritual reflected this imbalance, emphasizing purity and order while tolerating extreme violence against those deemed outside the moral community. And over time, this system produced diminishing returns, because repression bred resentment, resentment bred resistance, and resistance demanded ever greater force, locking Sparta into an escalating cycle that drained resources and limited adaptability. And when external threats emerged that required innovation, diplomacy, or economic flexibility, Sparta struggled because its entire social structure was optimized for internal control rather than external change. And the helots, though rarely named in heroic tales, were active participants in Sparta's history, shaping its decisions through their very existence, because every law, every training regimen, every political institution was designed with them in mind, making them the silent architects of Spartan society. And when we restore the helots to their rightful place in the story, the myth of Sparta collapses into something far more unsettling, a state that achieved stability through terror, cohesion through cruelty, and greatness through the systematic denial of humanity. And this truth forces us to confront an uncomfortable lesson, that the admired strength of Sparta was not free, not noble, and not self-sustaining, but purchased daily with suffering, fear, and blood. And while the names of Spartan kings and warriors echo through history, the voices of the helots remain largely unheard, buried beneath centuries of romanticization. And yet, without them, Sparta would have been nothing more than another struggling Greek settlement, because the real story they never show in movies is not just one of warriors and shields, but of fields worked by the enslaved, nights haunted by fear, and a society so dependent on oppression that it could never truly escape it. And in the end, it was this reliance on domination rather than adaptation that would contribute to Sparta's downfall, because a state built on fear must always fear its own foundations.
Spartan warfare is perhaps the most mythologized aspect of their society, reduced in popular culture to images of individual ferocity, fearless charges, and superhuman endurance. Yet the true nature of how Spartans fought is far more restrained, disciplined, and psychologically complex, because Spartan's strength did not come from reckless bravery or superior physical prowess alone, but from an obsessive commitment to order, cohesion, and collective control. And to understand Spartan warfare honestly, we must strip away the fantasy of lone warriors standing against impossible odds and instead examine the reality of a military system that valued conformity over heroics, survival over glory, and discipline over emotion. Because the Spartan hoplite was not trained to be exceptional as an individual, but interchangeable as a component of a larger machine. And this philosophy shaped everything from equipment to tactics to the very definition of courage itself. Because in Sparta, courage did not mean charging forward blindly or seeking personal fame, but holding one's position, maintaining formation, and trusting the man beside you even when every instinct screamed to flee. And this emphasis on cohesion began long before the battlefield, rooted in the agoge and reinforced through communal living, shared meals, and constant peer surveillance, creating soldiers who were psychologically conditioned to fear dishonor more than death, because dishonor meant exclusion from the collective, and exclusion in Sparta was a social death worse than any physical wound. And on the battlefield, this conditioning manifested in the phalanx, a tightly packed formation of heavily armed infantry where each man's shield protected not only himself but the man to his left, making individual survival dependent on collective discipline. And while the phalanx was used throughout Greece, Spartans elevated it to an art form through relentless drilling, synchronized movement, and unwavering adherence to command. And unlike other Greek armies composed largely of citizen soldiers who trained part-time, Spartan hoplites were professionals in everything but name, dedicating their lives to readiness. And yet, this professionalism did not make them invincible, because the phalanx was a blunt instrument, effective in frontal engagements on favorable terrain, but vulnerable to disruption, flanking, and innovation, weaknesses that Sparta would struggle to address because its doctrine emphasized repetition over adaptation. And Spartan equipment reflected this philosophy, favoring standardization and reliability over extravagance, with heavy bronze shields, spears, and armor designed not for individual flair, but for durability and uniform appearance, reinforcing the psychological effect of facing a wall of identical warriors moving as one. And this visual intimidation was as important as physical force, because Spartan warfare relied heavily on morale, both their own and their enemies. And ancient accounts repeatedly emphasize the unsettling calm of Spartan troops, their measured advance accompanied by flute music, designed to regulate pace and maintain formation rather than inspire frenzy, a stark contrast to the shouting and chaos of other armies. And this calm was not natural, but trained, a product of years spent suppressing emotion, learning to mask fear, and responding automatically to commands. Because in Sparta, emotion on the battlefield was dangerous, leading to impulsive action that could break formation and endanger everyone. And this explains why Spartan warfare discouraged individual heroism, because a hero who broke ranks endangered the group, and thus Spartan honors were often awarded not for daring exploits, but for discipline and obedience. And yet, despite this restraint, Spartan warfare was brutal, because close-order combat with spears and shields was exhausting, terrifying, and intensely personal. And holding formation under pressure required immense psychological endurance, especially when comrades fell and gaps threatened to open. And Spartans were trained to close those gaps instinctively, stepping forward without hesitation, absorbing shock after shock. And this endurance gave them an edge in prolonged engagements where less disciplined forces might break. But it also created a rigidity that could be exploited by more flexible opponents. And contrary to the popular myth that Spartans never retreated, historical evidence shows that they did withdraw when necessary, because retreat itself was not dishonorable if done in order, maintaining cohesion and avoiding panic. And this pragmatic approach reveals that Spartan commanders understood the realities of warfare, valuing preservation of the force over suicidal bravery. And yet, this pragmatism coexisted with severe social consequences for perceived cowardice, because a Spartan who lost his shield or fled in disorder faced lifelong disgrace, exclusion from communal meals, and public humiliation, a punishment that reinforced discipline but also fostered intense fear of failure. And this fear could cut both ways, motivating steadfastness while also discouraging initiative, because a soldier who deviated from orders risked being labeled a coward even if his actions were tactically sound.
And this tension between obedience and adaptability would become increasingly problematic as Greek warfare evolved, particularly during the Peloponnesian War, when new tactics, naval power, and prolonged campaigns challenged Spartans' traditional strengths. And while Spartan land forces remained formidable, their lack of naval expertise and economic flexibility limited their strategic options, forcing them to rely on allies and Persian funding to counter Athenian dominance at sea, a dependence that contradicted their ideological commitment to self-sufficiency and exposed vulnerabilities in their system. And even on land, Spartan supremacy was not absolute because their success depended heavily on terrain, timing, and morale. And when faced with opponents willing to adapt, such as the Thebans under Epaminondas, who used innovative tactics like the oblique phalanx to concentrate force and exploit Spartan rigidity, the myth of Spartan invincibility shattered, revealing that discipline alone could not compensate for inflexibility. And this moment marked a turning point, demonstrating that the very qualities that once made Sparta dominant had become liabilities in a changing military landscape. And yet, even in decline, Spartan warfare continued to influence Greek military thought, because their emphasis on training, cohesion, and psychological resilience set a standard that others sought to emulate, albeit often without adopting the extreme social controls that made it possible in Sparta. And it is also crucial to understand that Spartan warfare was not confined to set-piece battles, but extended into daily life, because the entire society functioned as a military camp with constant readiness, surveillance, and ritualized displays of unity, reinforcing the idea that war was not an event but a condition. And this mindset shaped how Spartans perceived peace, not as a state of relaxation, but a temporary lull requiring vigilance. And this perpetual readiness took a toll, because maintaining a society in a constant state of mobilization is exhausting, both materially and psychologically. And over time, this strain contributed to population decline, economic stagnation, and social rigidity, weakening Spartans' ability to respond to new challenges. And while Spartan warriors were admired for their endurance and courage, their lives were marked by constraint, because personal ambition, creativity, and even emotional expression were subordinated to military necessity. And this sacrifice was justified through ideology that framed warfare as the highest expression of virtue. Yet this framing masked the costs, both human and strategic, of a system that valued conformity over innovation. And when we compare Spartan warfare to that of other Greek states, the contrast is striking. Because Athens, for example, embraced a more diverse military approach, combining naval power, fortifications, and citizen participation, allowing for greater flexibility and adaptation. And while Athens lacked Spartans' discipline on land, it compensated with creativity and resources, ultimately shaping a model of warfare that proved more sustainable in the long run. And this comparison highlights a fundamental truth about Spartan warfare, that it was extraordinarily effective within a narrow set of conditions, but poorly suited to change, because its strength lay in repetition, not reinvention. And repetition requires stability, which Sparta increasingly lacked as its population dwindled and its enemies adapted. And yet, despite these limitations, the image of Spartan warriors endures because it appeals to a deep human fascination with order, sacrifice, and collective strength, offering a vision of unity and purpose that feels powerful in times of uncertainty. But this image obscures the reality that Spartan warfare was not a celebration of individual excellence, but a system that demanded submission, endurance, and silence, rewarding those who conformed and discarding those who did not. And when we look beyond the shields and spears, we see a military culture built on fear of dishonor, suppression of emotion, and responding automatically to commands. Because in Sparta, emotion on the battlefield was dangerous, leading to impulsive action that could break formation and endanger everyone. And this explains why Spartan warfare discouraged individual heroism, because a hero who broke ranks endangered the group, and thus Spartan honors were often awarded not for daring exploits, but for discipline and obedience. And yet, despite this restraint, Spartan warfare was brutal, because close-order combat with spears and shields was exhausting, terrifying, and intensely personal. And holding formation under pressure required immense psychological endurance, especially when comrades fell and gaps threatened to open. And Spartans were trained to close those gaps instinctively, stepping forward without hesitation, absorbing shock after shock. And this endurance gave them an edge in prolonged engagements where less disciplined forces might break, but it also created a rigidity that could be exploited by more flexible opponents. And contrary to the popular myth that Spartans never retreated, historical evidence shows that they did withdraw when necessary, because retreat itself was not dishonorable if done in order, maintaining cohesion and avoiding panic. And this pragmatic approach reveals that Spartan commanders understood
The Battle of Thermopylae has been frozen in popular imagination as a simple story of 300 Spartans standing alone against a vast Persian army, a tale of pure sacrifice and defiance that feels almost mythological in its clarity. Yet the real story is far more complex, more political, and far more revealing about Sparta and Greece than the legend ever suggests. Because Thermopylae was not a spontaneous act of heroic suicide, but a calculated military and diplomatic decision shaped by internal Spartan politics, religious constraints, alliance obligations, and strategic necessity. And to understand it properly, we must first step away from the imagery of slow-motion combat and shouted slogans and return to the world of 480 BCE, when the Persian Empire under Xerxes was the largest, most powerful force the Mediterranean world had ever seen, stretching from India to the Aegean, commanding immense resources, logistical sophistication, and manpower far beyond anything the fractured Greek city-states could muster individually. And yet, despite this imbalance, Greece was not facing annihilation blindly, because the Persian invasion was anticipated, debated, and prepared for, albeit unevenly, and Thermopylae emerged not as a glorious last stand chosen for honor alone, but as one piece of a broader, desperate strategy to delay, divide, and demoralize an overwhelming enemy. And at the center of this story stands Leonidas, a Spartan king often portrayed as a warrior poet who sought death for glory, but who in reality was a seasoned leader operating within severe constraints imposed by Spartan law and religious tradition. Because when news of Xerxes' advance reached Greece, Sparta was in the midst of the Carneia, a major religious festival during which full military mobilization was forbidden. And while modern audiences might scoff at the idea of religious observance delaying national defense, for Spartans these laws were not optional, because obedience to divine and ancestral law was foundational to their identity, and to violate it risked not only social collapse but divine punishment. And this meant that Sparta could not immediately deploy its full army, even in the face of existential threat, forcing a compromise that would later be transformed into legend, because Leonidas was dispatched with a small advance force, officially as a vanguard, to hold the narrow pass of Thermopylae until the main Greek forces could assemble. And the number 300, often emphasized as symbolic perfection, was in fact a practical decision, representing Leonidas' personal bodyguard of elite hoplites, each chosen because he already had a living son, ensuring that no Spartan family line would be extinguished by the mission. A detail that undercuts the idea of reckless martyrdom and reveals instead a calculated approach to risk management, even in desperate circumstances. And crucially, the Spartans did not go alone, despite how often this is erased in popular retellings, because alongside them marched thousands of allied Greek troops from various city-states, including Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, and others, bringing the total Greek force to several thousand at the outset. And these men were not passive extras in a Spartan drama, but active participants who fought, died, and made their own choices. And the decision to make a stand at Thermopylae itself was rooted in geography and strategy rather than symbolism, because the narrow coastal pass neutralized Persia's numerical advantage, forcing combat into a confined space where the Greek phalanx could function effectively. And this choice reflects a sober understanding of warfare rather than blind bravery, because the Greeks knew they could not win in open battle, but they could delay, inflict casualties, and buy time, and time was the most valuable resource they had. Because elsewhere the Greek fleet was maneuvering at Artemisium, attempting to counter Persian naval superiority, and the land and sea battles were interdependent, each buying time for the other. And this interconnected strategy highlights that Thermopylae was never intended to be a final stand in isolation, but part of a coordinated defense. And when the fighting began, it was not a chaotic melee of individual combat, but a series of brutal, controlled engagements where discipline and formation mattered more than individual strength. And Persian forces, despite their vast numbers, struggled initially to break the Greek line, suffering losses as they repeatedly assaulted the narrow pass. And this resistance shocked Persian commanders who expected swift victory, demonstrating that discipline and terrain could still challenge imperial might.
And yet the Greeks were never under the illusion that they could hold indefinitely, because supply lines, exhaustion, and the sheer scale of the Persian army made prolonged defense impossible. And this reality came into sharp focus when local Greek Ephialtes revealed a mountain path that allowed Persian forces to outflank the defenders, a moment often framed as pure betrayal, but which also reflects the complex realities of invasion, fear, and survival. Because collaboration with occupying forces was not uncommon in the ancient world. And when news of Xerxes' advance reached Greece, Sparta was in the midst of the Carnea, a major religious festival during which full military mobilization was forbidden. And while modern audiences might scoff at the idea of religious observance delaying national defense, for Spartans these laws were not optional, because obedience to divine and ancestral law was foundational to their identity, and to violate it risked not only social collapse but divine punishment. And this meant that Sparta could not immediately deploy its full army, even in the face of existential threat, forcing a compromise that would later be transformed into legend, because Leonidas was dispatched with a small advance force, officially as a vanguard, to hold the narrow pass of Thermopylae until the main Greek forces could assemble. And the number 300, often emphasized as symbolic perfection, was in fact a practical decision, representing Leonidas's personal bodyguard of elite hoplites, each chosen because he already had a living son, ensuring that no Spartan family line would be extinguished by the mission. A detail that undercuts the idea of reckless martyrdom and reveals instead a calculated approach to risk management, even in desperate circumstances. And crucially, the Spartans did not go alone, despite how often this is erased in popular retellings, because alongside them marched thousands of allied Greek troops from various city-states, including Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, and others, bringing the total Greek force to several thousand at the outset. And these men were not passive extras in a Spartan drama, but active participants who fought, died, and made their own choices. And the decision to make a stand at Thermopylae itself was rooted in geography and strategy rather than symbolism, because the narrow coastal pass neutralized Persia's numerical advantage, forcing combat into a confined space where the Greek phalanx could function effectively. And this choice reflects a sober understanding of warfare rather than blind bravery, because the Greeks knew they could not win in open battle, but they could delay, inflict casualties, and buy time, and time was the most valuable resource they had. Because elsewhere the Greek fleet was maneuvering at Artemisium, attempting to counter Persian naval superiority, and the land and sea battles were interdependent, each buying time for the other. And this interconnected strategy highlights that Thermopylae was never intended to be a final stand in isolation, but part of a coordinated defense. And when the fighting began, it was not a chaotic melee of individual combat, but a series of brutal, controlled engagements where discipline and formation mattered more than individual strength. And Persian forces, despite their vast numbers, struggled initially to break the Greek line, suffering losses as they repeatedly assaulted the narrow pass. And this resistance shocked Persian commanders who expected swift victory, demonstrating that discipline and terrain could still challenge imperial might. And yet the Greeks were never under the illusion that they could hold indefinitely, because supply lines, exhaustion, and the sheer scale of the Persian army made prolonged defense impossible. And this reality came into sharp focus when local Greek Ephialtes revealed a mountain path that allowed Persian forces to outflank the defenders, a moment often framed as pure betrayal, but which also reflects the complex realities of invasion, fear, and survival, because collaboration with occupying forces was not uncommon in the ancient world. And when news of Xerxes' advance reached Greece, Sparta was in the midst of the Carnea, a major religious festival during which full military mobilization was forbidden. And while modern audiences might scoff at the idea of religious observance delaying national defense, for Spartans these laws were not optional, because obedience to divine and ancestral law was foundational to their identity, and to violate it risked not only social collapse but divine punishment. And this meant that Sparta could not immediately deploy its full army, even in the face of existential threat, forcing a compromise that would later be transformed into legend, because Leonidas was dispatched with a small advance force, officially as a vanguard, to hold the narrow pass of Thermopylae until the main Greek forces could assemble.
And the number 300, often emphasized as symbolic perfection, was in fact a practical decision, representing Leonidas's personal bodyguard of elite hoplites, each chosen because he already had a living son, ensuring that no Spartan family line would be extinguished by the mission. A detail that undercuts the idea of reckless martyrdom and reveals instead a calculated approach to risk management, even in desperate circumstances. And crucially, the Spartans did not go alone, despite how often this is erased in popular retellings, because alongside them marched thousands of allied Greek troops from various city-states, including Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, and others, bringing the total Greek force to several thousand at the outset. And these men were not passive extras in a Spartan drama, but active participants who fought, died, and made their own choices. And the decision to make a stand at Thermopylae itself was rooted in geography and strategy rather than symbolism, because the narrow coastal pass neutralized Persia's numerical advantage, forcing combat into a confined space where the Greek phalanx could function effectively. And this choice reflects a sober understanding of warfare rather than blind bravery, because the Greeks knew they could not win an open battle, but they could delay, inflict casualties, and buy time, and time was the most valuable resource they had. Because elsewhere the Greek fleet was maneuvering at Artemisium, attempting to counter Persian naval superiority, and the land and sea battles were interdependent, each buying time for the other. And this interconnected strategy highlights that Thermopylae was never intended to be a final stand in isolation, but part of a coordinated defense. And when the fighting began, it was not a chaotic melee of individual combat, but a series of brutal, controlled engagements where discipline and formation mattered.
The decline of Sparta was not sudden, dramatic, or caused by a single catastrophic defeat, but slow, structural, and deeply ironic, because the very system that had once made Sparta powerful ultimately made it fragile, inflexible, and unable to survive a changing world. And to understand this decline, we must abandon the idea that Sparta fell because it lost its warrior spirit, because in truth, it never stopped valuing discipline, endurance, or military virtue, but rather because it valued them to the exclusion of everything else, creating a society so rigid that adaptation became impossible without undermining its own foundations. And the most critical factor in Sparta's decline was demographic collapse, a problem that haunted the city-state for generations and steadily eroded its military strength. Because Spartan citizenship was restricted to a narrow class of Spartiates who had completed the agoge, maintained membership in a Syssition, and possessed enough land to contribute their share. And over time, this pool shrank dramatically due to constant warfare, late marriages, inheritance concentration, and the exclusion of those who failed to meet increasingly strict criteria. And as citizen numbers fell, the very basis of Sparta's hoplite army weakened, because fewer full citizens meant fewer soldiers eligible to fight in the phalanx. And this decline was compounded by economic inequality, because despite ideological claims of equality, land ownership became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small elite, often through inheritance by women, which further reduced the number of citizens who could meet the material requirements for full participation, creating a class of disenfranchised Spartans known as hypomaions, men who were Spartan by birth but excluded from political and military life, breeding resentment and undermining unity. And instead of reforming the system to broaden citizenship or redistribute land, Sparta doubled down on tradition, treating reform itself as a threat, because any change risked destabilizing the delicate balance of control over the helot population. And this fear of internal collapse paralyzed Spartan innovation, making leaders reluctant to experiment with new military tactics, political reforms, or economic policies. And this rigidity became increasingly costly as the nature of Greek warfare evolved, particularly after the Peloponnesian War, when prolonged campaigns, naval power, and professional armies became more important. And while Sparta technically emerged victorious over Athens in that conflict, the victory was hollow, because it relied heavily on Persian financial support, exposing Sparta's economic weakness and ideological hypocrisy. And ruling over a defeated Athens also forced Sparta into a role it was poorly suited for, managing alliances, suppressing revolts, and governing an empire, tasks that required diplomacy, flexibility, and administrative capacity rather than brute force. And Spartan rule quickly became unpopular as they imposed oligarchic governments backed by force, contradicting their image as defenders of Greek freedom and provoking resistance across the Aegean.
And this overextension further strained their limited manpower, while internal problems continued to worsen, because the helot population remained a constant threat, requiring ongoing repression and diverting military attention inward. And natural disasters such as earthquakes periodically devastated Laconia, killing citizens and triggering helot revolts that exposed the vulnerability of Spartan control. And the most decisive blow to Spartan military prestige came at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, when the Theban general Epaminondas employed innovative tactics that shattered the Spartan phalanx, concentrating force on one wing and breaking the myth of Spartan invincibility. And this defeat was not just a battlefield loss, but a psychological shock, because it demonstrated that discipline without adaptability was insufficient. And for the first time, a Greek army had decisively defeated Sparta in open battle. And the consequences were immediate and profound, as Thebes invaded Laconia, liberated Messenia, and freed the helots who had sustained Sparta's economy for centuries, effectively removing the economic foundation of the Spartan state. And without helot labor, Sparta could no longer support a professional warrior class, and without Messenia's fertile land, it lost the resources needed to maintain its social system. And attempts at reform came too late and were too limited, as conservative elites resisted changes that threatened their privileges. And while later leaders proposed land redistribution or expansion of citizenship, these measures were never fully implemented because they contradicted the very ideology that defined Spartan identity. And as a result, Sparta became increasingly irrelevant, reduced from a dominant power to a regional backwater, admired for its past rather than feared for its present. And while it continued to exist for centuries, its political influence faded, its military reputation diminished, and its society ossified, becoming a living relic of an earlier age. And the tragedy of Sparta's decline lies not in betrayal or decadence, but in overcommitment to a single model of strength. Because Sparta believed that survival required rigidity, but in doing so, it sacrificed resilience. And this story serves as a powerful reminder that no system, however effective in one context, can endure unchanged forever, and that strength without adaptability is ultimately brittle, because the world does not stand still for those who refuse to change. And when we step back to compare Sparta with its rivals, particularly Athens, the contrast reveals why history ultimately favored ideas over arms. Because while Sparta perfected discipline and obedience, Athens cultivated debate, creativity, and intellectual exploration, producing philosophy, drama, science, and political concepts that continue to shape the modern world. And although Athens fell militarily and suffered its own failures, its legacy proved far more durable, because ideas can be transmitted, adapted, and reinterpreted long after armies dissolve, while a system built entirely on control and force leaves little behind once its power fades. And this does not mean that Athens was morally superior in all respects, or that Sparta was uniquely cruel, but it does mean that Sparta's contribution to history was limited by its refusal to evolve beyond survival, because it left no philosophical school, no artistic tradition, and few written records of its own voice, relying instead on outsiders to tell its story, which allowed myth to overshadow reality. And this myth, shaped by ancient admirers and modern storytellers alike, has transformed Sparta into a symbol rather than a society, a shorthand for toughness, sacrifice, and discipline divorced from context. And it is precisely this abstraction that makes Sparta so appealing and so dangerous as an ideal. Because when we admire Sparta without understanding it, we risk celebrating strength without questioning its cost, unity without examining who is excluded, and discipline without acknowledging what is suppressed. The real story of Sparta is not one of flawless warriors or perfect order, but of humans making extreme choices under extreme pressure, building a system that prioritized control over compassion and endurance over joy. And for a time, this system worked, producing stability and military success in a hostile environment. But it also demanded sacrifices that accumulated over generations, hollowing out the society from within until there was nothing left to sustain it. And this is why Sparta ultimately lost to history, not because it lacked courage, but because it mistook rigidity for permanence and fear for strength. And as we look back on Sparta today, stripped from cinematic exaggeration and nationalist fantasy, what remains is a cautionary tale about the limits of militarism, the dangers of dehumanization, and the fragility of societies that define themselves by a single value.
And yet Sparta continues to fascinate us precisely because it forces uncomfortable questions about how much control a society can impose in the name of security, how much individuality can be sacrificed for unity, and whether strength without humanity is truly strength at all. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of Sparta, not the battles it fought or the enemies it defeated, but the mirror it holds up to us, reflecting our own struggles between order and freedom, discipline and creativity, survival and meaning, reminding us that history is not just a record of what happened, but a warning about what happens when power is pursued without balance and when myths are allowed to replace truth. Because the Spartans were real people, living real lives under a system that demanded everything and gave little in return. And to understand them honestly is not to glorify or condemn, but to learn. And that is the story they never show in movies.